Good morning, everybody. Well, good noon. This is John Berry for our annual monthly AIPG Texas webinar. And this month we have Alexander Bump from the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas talking about carbon capture and storage. Alex has a PhD in structural geology and tectonics from the University of Arizona and spent almost 2 decades in petroleum exploration, as did I, with experience on 6 continents. And his current work focuses on adapting petroleum exploration tools for carbon capture and storage. And he and I had a very interesting discussion of how the requirements for CCS differ from those for petroleum exploration, which I think Alex will get into. So without further ado, here is Alex.
Very good.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, John. And thanks to all of you for coming today. I see there are 47 online, and I also see that one has audio issues. So if that's more widespread than one, please put something in the chat and let us know. So we hear a lot about energy transition, of course, and we think a lot about it as geoscience professionals. As you heard from John, my story is one example of energy transition, of going from oil and gas to carbon capture and storage. So as John said, we had a fascinating talk about CCS, and this is essentially the extended dance remix of that talk, the wider story of carbon capture and storage. So having said that, let me start with a little bit of context. Some of you will recognize this. January 10th, 1901, Spindletop came in. And of course, it kicked off the oil age in Texas and Gulf Coast generally, perhaps wider, with far-reaching implications, right? It transformed civilization. Oil brought heat, light, mobility. Mobility, as I said, it's fueled the information age and lifted literally billions from poverty. It is hard to overstate the impact of hydrocarbons on our world today. The oil market in annual revenue terms is worth more than twice the top 10 metal markets combined, right? So the size of the bubbles there is representative of the annual market value in oil trade versus iron, gold, copper, and so on. Again, it is hard to overstate the impact of oil and gas. That said, there are other impacts less favorable. As we know, atmospheric CO2 concentrations fluctuate all the time. And the graph here shows you atmospheric CO2 concentration over the last 800,000 years. And it goes up and down with basically in cycle with Milankovitch cycles, orbital cycles, and with glaciations. But where we are now is well above anything in the last 800,000 years. And some of you, of course, are geologists. Some of you will point out that in historic terms or geologic terms, we are at one of the low ebbs in Earth's carbon cycle. And that's perfectly true. The graph here shows that. What you see is age on the horizontal, stretching back 450 million years or so into the Ordovician. And you'll notice there's a change in scale from panel A to B to C. So it's decidedly non-linear. But CO2 concentration is on the vertical. And you can see it's a noisy record because geology, and because we're trying to reconstruct it over long time periods. But it clearly goes up and down. And we are definitely at one of the low ebbs in Earth's climate cycle. Polar glaciation, of course, is a rare thing. Polar ice caps are rare in the geologic record. We have them today, which definitely puts us at one of the cold ebbs. So what's the big deal? And I put the big deal in human terms. Effectively, what we've built our civilization on the world as it is today. And given time, we and ecosystems and whatever can adapt. But of course, climate change can be really quick. And changing water stress, changing crop patterns, changing disease patterns, heat waves, hurricanes, changing coastlines. all of that has the potential to destabilize the civilization that we've built. So if you really want some, some light bedtime reading, check out the US Director of National Security's annual threat assessment. There is a publicly released version, the light version, if you will. And if you open it, right below the usual state actors and threats, transnational issues, we have shared domains, environmental change and extreme weather. Page 33. And it is all about the potential destabilizing influence on global civilizations of those things that I just showed. There are also, if you care for some really scary stuff, potential tipping points in the climate. And these are things like melting Arctic sea ice, right? If you substitute light, reflective sea ice for dark, heat-absorbing water, you, of course, create a feedback loop that results in more warming. Same thing with loss of the Amazon rainforest and substitution of grasslands. There's a whole list of them that we think are a few degrees away, but they're really hard to reverse. And of course, we don't know. These are the things we'd really rather stay away from. Which brings me to, sorry, I skipped a slide in there. Brings me to, what do we do about it? There are a number of sources of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I love the diagram here. By the way, the link, I've given AIPG the PDF of this. You can follow the links and explore whatever you want in this. But this one puts the big buckets in the center of the diagram and then progressively subdivides them in the outer circles of the wheel. So about 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions come from energy consumption in one form or another, right? And if you go out on the spokes a little bit, you can see energy use in industry is about 1/4. Transport globally is about 16% of the total. Energy use in buildings, things like heating and cooking, is 17%. And then, of course, there's a 25% that is not energy per se. It's industry, it's landfills, and it's agriculture and other land use. Getting to net zero, everyone who thinks seriously about this has their own particular mix of solutions, but in broad terms, they're all pretty much the same. Everyone agrees it is an all hands on deck sort of problem. Requires all available solutions. And it's about 1/3 efficiency gains, about 1/3 renewables, energy switching, solar and wind, hydro, and about 1/3 everything else. So nuclear, CCS, fuel switching, other things like biochar or reforestation or whatever, right? And you look at this graph and you go, CCS, 9%? What's the big deal? Which is a fair question. If you read the headlines, and most of us do, we see lots of conflicting statements about CCS. CCS won't save oil and gas. Exxon seeks $100 billion for Houston carbon capture plan. The world banking on giant carbon-sucking fans to clean our climate mess. Big risk, right? The list goes on. Cheers industry, worries greens. Low emission technology to receive $500 million boost. Only working CCS project fails to meet target. Right? What do you make of all this? So why do CCS? There's basically 5 reasons. One is that some emissions are really hard to abate. So over on the left, you see the wheel, a diagram of global fossil fuel and industry emissions. And those broadened spokes are the things that are really hard to abate. And they're things like process emissions from cement and steel production, which are the blue and purple. So you can substitute renewable energy use just renewables, but you're still left with the coke in steel and the breakdown of calcium carbonate in limestone, both of which produce CO2 and both of which are fundamental process emissions. The orange spokes are about long distance transport. And again, electrified vehicles are great, But electrified airplanes and electrified and long-haul trucking, really difficult. The other one is about load, the red one is about load following electricity. And I'll come to that in a second. So the second one on this is about atmospheric carbon removal. And it's about drawing down the carbon that is either already in the atmosphere or that you can't abate at the source. Things like flight, the emissions of airplanes. You know, you can still fly airplanes, but we can take the carbon out of the atmosphere. The third one here is about load following power, or dispatchable power as it's called. And renewables are wonderful, but sun doesn't shine all the time. Wind doesn't blow all the time. You need something that can cover the gap, night in a word. And you can do that in various forms. You can build large-scale energy storage, whether it's batteries or molten salt or pumping water up a hill. Or you can put CCS on traditional historic combustion-fired power plants, keep the investment in the infrastructure, and of course, abate the emissions. The other two are about economically meeting climate targets and strategic risk management. And these come from an IPCC study on CCS and on paths to net zero generally. And basically the finding was that if you take CCS out of the mix, and they looked at lots of things, taking out nuclear, limiting solar and wind, and none of it made much difference because you had other elements to balance that. If you limit solar and wind, you use more nuclear, fine, right? But if you take out CCS, the costs for any given level of mitigation more than doubled. And the paths to net zero shrank from about 15 identified paths to many, many fewer. So, and the reason for that is that without CCS to abate hard to abate emissions, load following power, and all that kind of thing, you rely on large-scale human behavior adjustment and large-scale reforestation, neither of which, well, make your own judgments about how plausible they are. Difficult, in a word. So that's why CCS. What is it? It's basically three parts, which of course starts with capture. The clue is in the name in a sense. And capture can take various forms. It can be absorption, adsorption. It can be membranes, which are still R&D at this point. It can be cryogenic, which is still theoretical. Absorption and adsorption are very well proven, well-developed technologies. And you see two examples here. The one on the left is a coal-fired power plant outside of Houston, and the big tower in the middle is the adsorption columns. So there's cascading amine solution that goes through the rising exhaust from the power plant. Effectively, the amines bind with the CO2. You catch them at the bottom, heat them to drive off the CO2, and recycle them. Take the CO2 elsewhere. The other one, the one on the right, is Air Products hydrogen production facility outside Port Arthur, Texas. And the circled vessels on the left are adsorption tanks. They're vacuum swing adsorbers. So it kind of looks like, you know, refining technology. The second part of CCS, of course, is transport. You got to get from source to a storage site, and all the usual suspects are in play. Pipelines, ships, the first of which are actually now in service for CCS. But you can also use trains and trucks, and they have all the usual trade-offs, right? Capacity versus flexibility versus cost, effectively. And the last part, as geoscientists, the part we love, is storage, right? And you've got, again, various options. We can use saline formations, wet reservoirs, in a word. We can use, in theory, deep unminable coal seams, where CO2 is adsorbed onto the coal. Not well tested, but in theory, perfectly viable. We can use CO2 in enhanced oil recovery, which soaks up a lot of CO2 in the subsurface. Very well tested. And of course, we can put it into depleted oil and gas reservoirs. And I'll come back to all of those, but I will mostly focus on saline formations in this talk, just because that is the giant very flexible reservoir. And it's also the interesting one because we get to rethink what we target for storage. So, having said that, storage, the part that we know and love. The first consideration here is that CO2 is a really compressible fluid. And at atmospheric conditions, of course, it is a low density gas. But as we go into the subsurface, which is what this diagram is trying to show, temperature increases and pressure increases. And temperature increase, of course, would push density lower, but the pressure increase dominates here. And about 800 meters below water surface, whether that's water table or sea surface or whatever, you go from gas to dense phase fluid. And I say dense phase fluid because the distinction between liquid and supercritical fluid depends on the temperature. Most of the time it's supercritical, but in cold conditions, it'll be liquid. Doesn't really matter for storage. What we're after is dense because it minimizes the buoyancy pressure and it maximizes the use of pore space. And just for reference, oil and gas and water densities. So if you look at a cross section like this, and I used to spend a lot of time drawing these things. This is Gulf of Mexico. Up dip, of course, is on the left. Down dip and deep water is on the right. Coastline is roughly smack in the middle of this. If you can read the print, it's the up dip side of Texas state waters. But you see familiar pergrading passive margin, right? Jurassic sediments in blue, Cretaceous building out over them, and so on, out into deep waters today. Complicated by mobile salt, which is the pink. But nevertheless, familiar pergrading passive margin. And if you're thinking oil and gas, you worry about all of this. All 15 kilometers of this depth section that I've drawn. Crustal structure influences heat flow and so on. We worry about that stuff. For CCS, we have two constraints on the storage window. One is that threshold for supercritical. The other, of course, is loss of porosity or top of overpressure, where we run out of pressure space to inject more. So what we are left with is actually a fairly narrow band. And there's real advantage to this. All the old vintage seismic actually images this pretty darn well. So that's our playground for CCS. And you see the horizontal top surface of that, 800 meters. The variable bottom surface, or variable depth bottom surface, is just about the depth to overpressure, which here varies as a function of the age of deposition. So young deposition, shelf edge, just hasn't had much time to dewater. So overpressure is fairly shallow. Skip that. If you apply this concept across the US, this is the result. And it's a map of the storage window thickness across the US. And of course, some areas have thick storage windows for CO2. Some areas in the beige have none. Welcome to geology, right? Resources are unevenly distributed. If you're thinking about storage plays and what you target, there are basically two end members now in use. One, which is the example on the left, is the depleted oil and gas field. And that's an example from south of France. It was a Total project called Lac Rousse, where they took an old depleted gas field and injected experimental quantities of CO2 into it to build expertise. We know that those fields can hold oil and gas, buoyant fluids, for geologic time. They hold CO2 quite well as well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it works quite well. I'll come back to it, but the big caveat with depleted fields is the old wells and whether they're engineered or capable of maintaining the pressure integrity as you refill the reservoir with CO2. So what we worry about is the integrity of those old wells. The other play, the one on the right, is a more CCS focused play. And the example there is Sleipner, which is the world's longest running commercial CCS project. It's an Equinor project in the Norwegian North Sea. And it's taking the CO2 from a high CO2 gas field, which is the red bit at depth there, and re-injecting it into a shallow wet reservoir, which is the blue one. And I'll show you a bit more. Or about CO2 storage versus petroleum production. And as I said, petroleum reservoirs will work. But if you start from scratch, CO2 production. And there are three key differences. First one is just lower margins. So what you see here is a graph of all of the world's carbon prices. And right away, you can see there's about 180 countries in the world, if I remember correctly. That list is not 180 countries in the world, right? Many countries do not have any CCS CO2 price. You'll also notice the horizontal axis, which is value, cost per ton. And I've marked $50 and $100. Oil price right now is about $83 a barrel. Very few countries can touch that in terms of CO2 price per ton. Mostly, this is a low margin business. It's pollution control, unlike any pollution control. Nobody wants to pay more than they have to. So what that means in practical terms is that we're looking for good enough. We come from metals or mining, oil and gas. Bigger is better, and we will go pretty much anywhere we have to get that. Not so with CO2. We start every project with a known source or cluster of emissions that we want to abate. So the geography is known, as are the rates and the volumes. And what you really want to find is storage that is good enough to accept those rates and volumes, but close to the source of emissions, right? More transport is more cost. So local and good enough. The second key difference is that our goal is sequestration, right? We don't want it back. So you could take the oil and gas, the gas fields that I'm showing here, and use them for CO2. All right, so for those unfamiliar, this is a very typical Gulf of Mexico sort of cross section with a salt diapir in pink and a bunch of sands that are thick in the syncline and thin, pinch out against the diapir or barely get over it, with hydrocarbon production on the highs. You could use the same thing for CO2, but given the goal of sequestration, what we would really like to do is go down dip and play for migration loss. So try to take advantage of poor throat trapping, dissolution, migration loss. Every little buoyant trap on the way up dip is a little bit of CO2 that is absolutely irretrievable. So the faults there, rugosity on top of flow units, crossbeds, little perm contrasts, each one of those traps a bit of CO2. And the modeling that we've done on this suggests you can arrest literally tens of megatons of CO2 on the migration path over a few kilometers. So as I like to say, one man's migration loss is another man's secure storage, because you're not getting that back ever. And I'll give you an example. These are sand tank models run by one of my colleagues here at the Carbon Center. They are analogs, of course. They're about 60 centimeters on the side, and they're filled with glass beads. So you see on the left, one that is fairly transparent. It's hard to see the crossbeds. And on the right, of course, really easy to see the crossbeds. The difference between these models, they're all the same geometry, but the difference between them is just the grain size contrast that goes into making the crossbeds. So you see that grain size contrast in the histograms at the top. But on the left, they're all medium to coarse sand equivalent. And on the right, you get medium to fine sand. So all reservoir, but just slightly greater contrast. But look at the effect when we put CO2 into this. So homogeneous model goes straight through. But as we add a little bit of heterogeneity to this, you see the CO2 get deflected by every one of those little perm contrasts and contact much more of the reservoir. So all of the stuff you see here is residually trapped. There's no seal on the top of this. We run it until we get CO2 out the top. But we've contacted less than 1% of the pore space on the left and about 40% on the right. And you can see the time to breakthrough go from 6.5 minutes up to 55 hours. I said I'd tell you a little bit more about Sleipner. It gives us a real world example of what I'm talking about here, where heterogeneity helps you to improve residual trapping, helps to immobilize CO2. So the diagram on the left just shows you Sleipner. It's been injecting about 1 million tons a year since 1996, still going. And it injects into a nice thick sand called the Atsira Reservoir, and you see that on the right. You see the logs. It is a beautiful blocky sand, Darcy scale permeability. But you see those arrows, which are pointing out little excursions in the gamma ray, the sort of thing that I, as an explorer, would just overlook, discount as noise. But it turns out that each one of those is a meter scale silt, not a seal, just a silt. They have holes in them. There are volcanic fluid escape pipes that go right through them. But look at the effect on CO2. So this is for repeat seismic. It starts on the left with pre-injection, and then 2001, 2000, if I can read this right, 2004, 2006, and I think 2008. In map view, which are the bottom panels, you can see the CO2 plume spreading out. And the first of those panels has a scale bar in the upper right. So the image is about 2.5 kilometers across. So CO2 migrates, but not very far. The really interesting ones are the ones on the top. And they're showing you, of course, the cross-sectional view. And beneath each one of those little meter scale silts, there is a CO2 plume spreading out. So each one of those is serving to retard buoyant vertical migration of CO2, the buoyant migration, and create what is effectively a stack of pancakes rather than a wide, thin crepe. It keeps the plume small, makes the monitoring easier. The third difference is pressure buildup. So we are injecting CO2 at industrial rates. And as you've seen, sweep efficiency is highly uneven. Saturation is hard to predict. And of course, subsurface pore space is already full. We've got to find ways of getting more space for additional fluid. And there's unlimited ways to do that. Right? We can raise the land surface, which is basically inflating the reservoir, which is real. It happens. And you can measure it, but it's small. It's on the order of millimeters to centimeters. You can displace the existing fluids, push them somewhere else, and that also happens. But you really make space only if you can displace those to unoccupied pore space. That means effectively land surface or above the water table, which no one is going to be happy with, and it's definitely not permitted. Third way is dissolution, which is real but limited on injection timescales. And the fourth one is where most of our space comes from, and it's compression of the pre-existing fluids in the rock. And I'll give you an example of this. So this is another commercial project, decarbonizing a high CO2 gas field, also run by Equinor in the Barents Sea. So off the northern edge of Norway, the Arctic Norway. And you see on the on the left, a map. So they're producing gas out of the high fault block, which is the green one at the bottom, labeled Snøhvit main segment, if you can see it, separating the CO2 and re-injecting it into the adjacent fault block, which is where the red circle is. In cross-section, maybe you see it more clearly, producing out of main segment, re-injecting into F segment. And they re-inject it into a fluvial reservoir. You can see these are amplitude extractions from seismic, and you can see it's a heterogeneous reservoir. The interpretation on the right, has channels and crevasse splays and so on. No one is going to defend that one very hard. But the point here is it's a heterogeneous reservoir with, of course, large-scale faults that seal hydrocarbons. The pressure record, when they started to inject, is shown here in the graph. So we've got time on the horizontal, pressure on the vertical. Bottom hole pressure is the high one, the black line. Flowing top pressure or tubing pressure is the blue line, and injection rate is the red line. And you can see pressure builds, and then they shut the well in so that pressure can decline. They start injecting again, and pressure builds. And there's a limit to pressure, of course, or to pressure that is allowable. So they keep having to shut the well in to stay below that limit. It goes on for 3 years. They shot a repeat seismic survey, and these are two versions of it. The one on the left is processed to show pressure change. The one on the right is processed to show saturation change. So you see on the left this giant amplitude bloom around the well, all those red amplitudes showing large pressure increase. And clearly the fault seal, we knew that. But apparently there are also depositional permeabilities, that fluvial heterogeneity that seal this reservoir or this compartment east and west. The saturation change, on the other hand, the thing we would look at if we were exploring for oil and gas, I can't distinguish CO2 saturation from background noise in this. The key point here is pressure buildup is your fundamental limit. In this case, their solution was simply to recomplete the injector in a shallower reservoir with, of course, less compartmentalization. It's been absolutely fine ever since. But more broadly, what we look for in CO2 storage is places with good pressure dissipation. So my sort of idealized pure storage play is something like this. It's stacked storage over a buried hill. I made it a salt body in this case, given Gulf of Mexico. But what it allows you to do is dissipate pressure off to the right, good aquifer connection, thick sands, clean sands in the syncline, high injectivity, but a migration path for CO2 that is, of course, up dip and transitions into worse and worse reservoir quality, maybe even a waste zone, right? I would love that because it's completely immobilized CO2. Risk profile is absolutely minimal. And of course, there are plenty of variations on that storage play. You can paint an entire spectrum between that and traditional oil and gas plays. But this brings me, this question of risk and minimizing it brings me to what are the risks? And they're actually, I like to conceive of them as 6 risks. So if you have a hypothetical storage site and a source of emissions there, we can substitute atmospheric release for underground injection, put it into the subsurface, into a reservoir, and there are a handful of things that might go wrong. So one, it might escape up a fault. And generically, I think of this as unintended vertical migration of either CO2 or displaced brines, which actually are the nastier substance. So possibly up a fault, possibly up an old well, even your well, if you've badly cemented it, and possibly long distance migration, either off lease, which is one risk, or long distance migration that contacts something that allows you to leak vertically. All right, in this case, contaminating underground sources of drinking water, fresh water, or just finding a long tortuous flow path to escape. The other risk, of course, is induced seismicity. So I said there were 6 risks generically. It's unintended lateral migration of CO2 or displaced brine, that's 2. Unintended vertical migration of either of those, induced seismicity, or number 6, loss of injectivity due to pressure buildup, which is really a commercial risk for the operator. So mitigating against these, EPA, which is the permitting authority for this, defines what they call area of review, which is based on the pressure footprint or the CO2 footprint, whichever is larger, of the project. Diagram here shows you the CO2 injector with a CO2 plume at depth and that shaded region in the injection zone, which is meant to represent pressure. So pressure buildup high near the well, tailing off toward background with distance. And area of review is defined as the pressure increase sufficient to lift injection zone brines through a hypothetical open well bore to the level of lowest fresh water. So if I put it a different way, it's hydraulic head in the injection zone, equivalent or high enough to reach the lowest protected fresh water. So hydraulic head is shown as the red line in this, up in the air above the well, and of course, getting lower and lower with distance from the well. Within that area of review, you have to review every legacy penetration and potentially remediate them. So the picture here is Spindletop. It's the same picture that I opened this talk with, except 2.5 years later, even less than 2 years later. Someone actually called me with a great idea. They're going to repurpose a depleted field. It was a giant thing. It was thoroughly depleted. They're going to store CO2 in it. It sounded great until I found out what the field was. It was Spindletop. It was this. And this forest of derricks, can you imagine trying to find the records for these things? They were built, of course, drilled long before the advent of oil field cement, abandoned long before the advent of any modern regulations. This is a complete nightmare. And it's the reason that depleted fields in general are a big maybe for CO2. Can you assure the integrity of the old wells? Which brings me to this. What if it all goes wrong? And I've got a couple examples of this. One is an actual CO2 pipeline on the Gulf Coast called the Green Line. It was built by Denbury and operated by Denbury, which has now been bought by ExxonMobil. But in February 2020, heavy rains washed out the support under that pipeline here in Yazoo County, Mississippi. Without the support under it, the pipeline sagged and broke. And you see the effect of it there. That's actually ice. The white is ice there. And it's caused, of course, by rapid expansion of CO2, which cools the air and crystallizes humidity in the air. There are reports from that incident of cars stalling on this road because, of course, high CO2. Combustion didn't work so well. No fatalities, no serious injuries, but 300 people evacuated from the homes and 46 taken to hospitals. Not a good thing. And of course, CO2 in low concentrations, we breathe it. It's all around us. It's fine. But as you can see from the diagram on the right, higher and higher concentrations produce worse and worse effects. Basically, it looks like drunkenness until the point of 8% and above, which can cause death. Generally, topography and wind disperse CO2. But if you have still air and a low in the topography, you can concentrate it, which is definitely not good. Here's my second example of what happens when it all goes wrong. And this is a failed exploration well outside of Green River, Utah. It's a 1930s exploration well for hydrocarbons, of course, that found CO2. And the operators just walked away. They never plugged and abandoned it. So every 20 minutes or so, it erupts. Right? Groundwater flows into it, creates pressure on the reservoir. Rising CO2 mixes with the groundwater, builds pressure, and lightens the fluid column by mixing gas into it, and it creates an eruption. This one has space, has topography, and generally wind to dissipate the CO2. It's a tourist attraction. You can actually see people walking around it in the upper right picture. So 2 reality checks, and I see the questions, Russ. I'll get to them at the end of this. 2 reality checks on this. One, Mother Nature has stored an awful lot of CO2. I personally have drilled 2 of Mother Nature's CO2 accumulations in the course for hydrocarbon exploration. The picture here, the map here, shows a bunch of them, and it is by no means complete. There are lots and lots of naturally occurring CO2 accumulations that are not on the map, but that have been stable for geologic time. Second reality check is that we, humans, have been injecting CO2 into the subsurface since 1972. The first CO2 injection was West Texas for CO2 enhanced oil recovery. there is actually a lot of experience doing this. So every dot on this map shows a CCS project, either a commercial CO2 storage project, a commercial CO2 EOR project, a pilot project, or a demo project. There's, I think, 79 of them on this map. The map is a couple of years old. There is an awful lot of experience doing this. Which brings to the question, why isn't it bigger? Why aren't we doing more of this? And this gets to your question, Russ, about how underground CCS can ever be economically feasible. Barrier one, and there are a number of barriers to doing this. Barrier one is just the legal framework. So the map shows you an assessment of legal maturity, country by country, for CCS. US, Canada, Norway, UK, Australia lead the world. Most of the world is in some stage of development from 0 to something. But there are a whole lot of questions, right? Is there a permitting process? Is there provision for crossing borders, whether it's state borders or country borders? What defines a storage site? Who owns pore space? Is there provision for eminent domain, common carrier status, unitization of land positions? Do you classify CO2 as waste or hazardous waste? What are the legal requirements for a storage site, for running, for drilling, for whatever, a storage site? Who holds the liability? All these questions have to be answered, right? And if you've never done CCS, there's no law on the books for it. So barrier two, which is huge, is public acceptance. And as you saw in one of those opening slides of headlines, there's a variety of views. Most people just don't know anything about this. And the first reaction to something new is to go, hang on, what is this? Do I really want this? What are you talking about here? Right? The first reaction is generally a no. So two images here. One comes from a report by the Ohio River Valley Institute. And it is a common sort of view of CCS. You've got a power plant there, got an oil well, and you've got this CO2 plume that appears not very far below the surface, right? If you scale the power plant, take that for the scale. How tall is a power plant? 200 feet. So you've got a CO2 plume rising toward the surface, only 200 feet below. It looks scary, right? I don't want this in my backyard either. The one on the right is a protest against an Air Products CO2 storage site that is in active development under Lake Maurepas, which is just upstream of New Orleans. Save our lake, right? It sounds absolutely disastrous. You know, the reality is that they will drill extended reach wells from shore under the lake. The lake will be absolutely untouched. But there's a lot of fear about what CCS might mean. Industrialization, leakage, what is this stuff? Big companies can't be good, right? Both political extremes are really skeptical of this. One sees it as government interference and a waste of money, and the other one sees it as propping up big oil and more money for fat cats and a distraction from what we really should be doing in their view, which is all solar. I would say it's in the middle, right? It is a cost, but it's worthwhile and can be completely safe. Barrier three is incentive, right? The graph here shows carbon prices or countries with some sort of carbon pricing mechanism as a function of time. So time on the horizontal, it starts in 1990 with Finland and Estonia. And up until 2004, it was basically Finland, Estonia, and Poland. In 2005, we see a little bit more. That's the first red edition. And you can see the number of stripes growing with each passing year. So historically, there's been very little incentive to do this, aside from CO2 EOR, which is the only thing that paid to inject CO2. At present, the vertical axis on this graph is percent of the world's emissions that are covered by a carbon pricing carbon pricing mechanism, which might be a tax, it might be a cap and trade program. It could be a take back obligation, which is hypothetical at this point. No one is doing it. But it all adds up to about a quarter of the world's emissions. Weigh that against the costs. So cost very much depends on two things that are not geology. One is capture, and this is the big cost, typically. Capture is inverse, or cost of capture is inversely proportional to the CO2 purity. So things that emit a really pure stream of CO2, like petrochemical production, ethanol production, LNG, or gas processing, hydrogen production, those are really cheap to capture. Those are close to pure CO2 streams. For reference, cement and steel process emissions are about 25% CO2 in the exhaust stream. Coal-fired power is about 14%. Gas-fired power is about 4%. Air, of course, is 400%. There's a wide spectrum. And the more dilute the CO2 stream, the more expensive it is to capture and separate. Second big cost is transport, which is directly proportional to distance. And the graph there in the middle gives you an idea of pipeline cost proportional to distance. It's a function of diameter, which is capacity, of course, and distance. Storage is the cheap thing in this equation. The map there comes from one of my students from a couple of years ago. And it gives some indication of the storage cost per ton of CO2, which of course varies with the geology. But it's somewhere between $6 and $7 a ton on the cheap end, up to 35, 40. And it really depends on how many wells do you need to drill, how much acreage do you need to access to store a given volume of CO2. This one reflects the challenge. So it's all US point sources of CO2 arranged by cost of capture, transport, and storage. So on the left side, you have the really cheap ones, which are the hydrogen, ethanol, LNG. But there aren't very many of those. Right? The cumulative volume, which is the horizontal axis of this, those cheap sources, things that you could capture and store for under $50 a ton, gets you maybe 50 million tons a year out of a total US emissions about 6.5 billion tons. If you get to, say, $85 a ton, which is the first inflection point on this graph, then you could incentivize about 100 million tons. If you got to $100 a ton, now you've incentivized about 300 million tons. $125 a ton, now you're talking about a gigaton. And you can assemble similar curves for any country or even global emissions. But this is the trade-off, the cost benefit. So where does this go? If it's properly incentivized, you could grow it fast. And these curves are taking historic oil industry growth curves, number of wells on the left axis, and equivalent CO2, if there were CO2 injectors on the right-hand axis, and just normalizing those growth curves to 2020. So Texas onshore is the blue. That was very early in the oil industry. It grew slowly. Gulf of Mexico offshore is the orange curve, and Norway offshore, the most recent of these, is the red one. So with modern technology, if you properly incentivize this, within 10 years, you could be storing 10 gigatons, something like that. But it's all down to the incentive. In the US, we incentivize this with tax credits. And this is the reason for this is pure politics. This is the compromise that got through Congress. Got through in 2008, and it incentivized CO2 storage at $20 a ton for saline storage, $10 if you're using it for CO2 EOR. And as you remember from the cost curve I showed you, $20 isn't going to incentivize much. It didn't. That changed in 2018 with amendments to the tax code, which increased the incentive to $50 a ton. And I won't go through the details of this graph. Takeaway message is $50 a ton for saline storage, $35 if it's EOR. That got an awful lot of attention, an awful lot of industry interest, looking around going, what could we do here? It changed again with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which raised the tax credit from $50 to $85 a ton, also pushed the sunset clause out and made these things tradable. So made it a more investable proposition. And at $85 a ton, there is an awful lot of interest. So I'm not kidding when I say awful lot of interest. There is a new gold rush on, and you can scan through the headlines here. $500 million, $7 billion, $6.5 billion. This one, Alberta. It is not limited to the US. This has spurred other countries to take action and increase their own carbon prices. UAE, $7 billion, $17 billion. The current landscape in North America looks like this. These are all publicly announced projects. So ones that are actively being, storage projects actively being permitted in the red and orange, capture projects in the orange, existing CO2 EOR projects in blue, and planned storage projects in pure red. There's an incredible number. On the Gulf Coast alone, there are over 50 storage projects with 7 billion tons of claimed capacity, 330 million tons annual injection planned, all as a result of better incentives. And I'll close with this, which is a view from Goldman Sachs, their 2023 climate report, and a message from Jamie Dimon, CEO, that says, we believe that a successful transition generates economic growth, preserves energy security and affordability, mitigates the worst impacts of climate change. But all good, motherhood and apple pie, right? But the thing that gets attention, in order to successfully achieve that transition, a massive ramp up to the tune of $4 trillion of annual investment will be needed, bringing with it the potential to generate a wave of growth and opportunity the world hasn't seen since the first industrial revolution. Wow, that gets attention. So is it heralding a new age of exploration? Maybe. One hopes. I don't think we'll get Lockheeds and Camels, but who knows? So with that, let me say thank you to sponsors of the Gulf Coast Carbon Center, and in particular, Department of Energy, who is our major sponsor. And thanks to all of you for listening. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Alex. That was a wonderful talk. And I think there are a few questions in the chat here already. I think you may have answered the first one in. Russ Patterson asked, how can underground CCS be economically feasible? I think you've addressed that. You may want to add something for Russ. I'm not sure.
Russ, if I didn't ask it or I didn't answer it, please say so. You were anticipating where I was going, so thank you for that.
I think he had that in a long while ago, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whoops.
That's a long one.
That one is a long one, but there's one here. Somebody's talking about having just signed lease papers for a pilot study in Wyoming.
Good on you.
Do you want to say anything, John Ward there? I'm quite sure what he's getting at.
I see, John, you mentioning Texas is luckier than Arizona. Yes, in terms of storage resource. Yeah. If we assume a 30% energy penalty, one could envision a new power plant for every 2 or 3 existing plants just to supply the power for CCS. So 2 things to say about that. You are right about the energy penalty. If you're capturing CO2 from a power plant, there is a significant energy penalty to drive the capture, the recycling of amines and the release of CO2. Keep in mind, this is the power and peril of CO2, of CCS. You can abate the emissions of existing power plants, but there is no free lunch, right? You're going to pay to do it. So where this is worthwhile is going to vary. In a lot of cases, it's going to be worthwhile just to run the plant through its design life and substitute solar and wind. But you keep some of that. We're never going to abate the entire power sector with CCS. And the power sector is one of the less pure sources of CO2. Where this is going to work best is the things you can't address any other way, and the really pure emissions. You keep it for where you need it, but power, it's not going to be your first choice. So absolutely fair question, and you're spot on.
The long one by Craig Clemens, he's basically making the point that there's no 100% guarantee the reservoirs will remain intact for eternity. I think this is the same objection that we have for nuclear power waste.
Yeah. And literally, you're absolutely right, Craig. There is no guarantee. Our crystal ball for the future is never going to be perfect. What we do know is historical analog, right? We can reservoir oil and gas, which are similarly buoyant fluids, for geologic time. We can even exhume waste zones, so zones that have residually trapped oil in particular. We can see them in outcrop, and the oil is still not leaking because it's residually trapped. We can do the same thing with CO2, and that's the point of playing for migration loss effectively. But monitoring and ongoing assurance is a key part of this. So intelligent site design, absolutely. We can minimize the risks, but you do want to monitor it. And that's part of the permitting, part of the licensing for these projects. I sometimes use the analogy of building a bridge, right? And if you want to, bridges, of course, are fantastic and everyday occurrences. We use them to span waterways and gorges and so on. But if you were against building bridges, you could say that they suspend innocent civilians hundreds of meters above raging waters, subject people to needless danger, et cetera, right? They do collapse, right? We can point to instances of bridge collapse. But of course, bridges are familiar technology, and we have really well-honed practices for design, for maintenance, for inspection. We have a lot of that for CCS, but of course, not the public familiarity with CCS. So the dangers and the potential risks get a lot of play. And fair enough, look at them, weigh them. But there's also a lot of fear-mongering and claims of failed CCS that are really about economic failure rather than technical failure. So there's a long conversation to have about this, but I hope that addresses at least a little bit of what you're saying.
I think the next two questions, Alex, Robin Swank and Harvey Thorlifson, one's asking about the risks of leaking but for carbon dioxide versus oil and gas, and the other one is how serious a constraint is induced seismicity likely to be. And I think they're related.
Yeah, they are potentially related. So, leakage via faults is a huge concern for EPA. Less of a concern for those of us coming from oil and gas. And the view from oil and gas is faults can seal. And of course, they can leak vertically as well, but they tend to leak vertically into the next permeable reservoir, and then you bleed CO2 off. It is an area of active research about how you assure faults. The easiest way, of course, is just to stay away from them, or to only permit sites that have faults that tip out below a certain horizon. So, and that's effectively where we are with CCS at present. I will say that CO2 EOR is at present done in places with surface breaking faults and absolutely no evidence of CO2 leakage. But it is a topic of active assurance. The other one about induced seismicity depends a lot on where you do this and how much you increase subsurface pressure. And effectively, those are the two risks. So we can see ways that features that we want to avoid. If you look at the Permian Basin and saltwater disposal today, there's a lot of induced seismicity. And if you put enough CO2 into the ground, you could do the same thing. We definitely want to avoid that. And part of smart site design, permitting, and monitoring is avoiding that feature. That said, not all places are equal. Right? Permian Basin is old, stiff rocks with basement not all that far below it. Gulf Coast, much younger, much more ductile, compressible rocks with basement 15 kilometers down. It's far less seismically prone, which is not to say you can inject everything you want, just that the thresholds are probably higher in the Gulf Coast. Not all places are created equal, but it's one of those things that will keep us as geoscientists employed for a long time.
We're almost out of time, but there are two related questions. There's one about academic past, but then there's two related ones after that. Maybe we would look at first about the Bob Keir says, I've never, in 50 years, he's never met a properly plugged well or well plugged according to what is described. And Patrick Sapinski is asking about the risk of just that when you utilize oil and gas, existing oil and gas areas.
Excellent questions. I mean, Robert, you know better than I. Trust, but I look at this like arms control negotiation. Trust, but verify. Right. And my conversations with CO2 EOR companies are really interesting because they're people who go into old fields with sometimes hundreds of old wells as a matter of routine. And they look these things over, remediate some of them, and then they bring it on CO2 EOR flood. They jack up the pressure and they keep some sort of eye on it. But what I learned from them is that you really have to calibrate your view of wells. So they have these charts of every law and the dates that it was passed. So one of the thresholds is how old are the wells and what laws applied at the time they were drilled, abandoned, so on. The other big one is who did these things. And they calibrate their view of different operators. Operator X, gold standard, don't worry about their wells. Operator Y, they fly by night. Check them out, verify those things. And I think you have to do the same with CCS. But the approach that most companies are taking, in fact, every company on the Gulf Coast is taking at this point, is avoid the old wells where at all possible. So all of the storage targets on the Gulf Coast are in the synclines. They're trying to avoid the old wells and touch as few of them as possible. The place where we see lots of interest in depleted fields is actually not the US. No one has proposed reusing a depleted field in the US. It's North Sea. And they're reusing old gas fields that are old only in the sense of pre-existing and depleted, but they were drilled in the 70s and 80s. So relatively new wells, gas, so no pressure support and few wells. And those actually are fairly attractive because few wells drilled by majors, pressure depleted, so you've got a lot of pressure headroom to put CO2 in, but not in the US.
So I think the last question here, it's very interesting in view of the next month's webinar, which I'll announce when you finish, but what classes or academic paths would you recommend for students interested in pursuing a career in CCS?
Oh, excellent question. I would say three things. One, geoscience, right? You need a solid foundation in geoscience, and it's the same stuff that all of us studied. Second, there's a lot of engineering in this. And so I, as geoscientist, am learning more and more reservoir engineering, petroleum engineering. So I would take some of those classes. But the bonus is that there are programs, we have some programs that have, geoscience programs that have some CO2 or CCS class now associated with them. We have one here at UT, and we're certainly not the only university. So if you pick your university, you could do an actual CCS class and even CCS related research, which would put you way in front of 95% of the people coming into this field.
Thank you very much, Alex. The next month's webinar will be given by Rebecca Dodge, and she will be talking about how we can involve geoscience students in universities in professional affairs, and then keep them involved through the years in which they're too busy raising families and things and generally drop out. So it's basically about keeping our professional organizations going in this time when there are so many competing factors. And again, thank you, Alex. And I thought it was a very, very interesting talk. I learned a lot.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. If anyone gets curious in the days, weeks that follow, feel free to reach out. I am, as you can see on the screen, I am funded in large part by your tax dollars. So feel free to take advantage.
Thanks again. And thank you to Wendy and Kathy for doing all the logistics of this series of talks.